My name is Clara Thorne, and I am 30 years old now, but this story begins when I was 28, standing on a patch of land that had belonged to my family for 200 years, feeling the distinct possibility that we would be the generation to lose it all. For most of my life, my family saw my greatest passion as a dirty secret, a strange and grubby habit that was a constant source of mild embarrassment at dinner parties. They never imagined that the mud I tracked through their pristine halls and the useless rocks I cluttered my room with would be the only thing standing between our legacy and total ruin. My father used to say that the Thorne family was built on solid ground, a metaphor for our history and our standing in the community. He never realized he was speaking a literal truth, a truth that was buried deep beneath his feet, waiting for someone to simply look down. Before I tell you how a lifetime of mockery turned into the most shocking family meeting of all time, the one that shattered our old world and built a new one from the dust, do me a favor and let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you have ever had a passion that no one else understood, go ahead and hit that like button. You are in good company here. It all started with my grandfather, Thomas Thorne. He was a man who saw the world differently. While my father, Richard, saw our estate, Blackwood Manor, as a series of assets and liabilities, of arable fields and fallow pastures, my grandfather saw it as a living library. He was not a geologist, not formally, but he was a naturalist of the old school. He would take me on long walks when I was a little girl, my small hand lost in his big, calloused one. He would point not at the trees, but at the rocks they grew from. "See this, Clara," he would say, tapping a gray, layered piece of shale with his walking stick. "This rock is telling a story. It is a page from a book written millions of years ago, when this whole valley was underwater." He gave me my first rock hammer for my 8th birthday. It was small, with a worn wooden handle, and it felt like a magic wand in my hands. To my father it was a dangerous tool. To my mother, Beatrice, it was an instrument for creating more laundry. To me it was the key to a secret world. That same year I found my first real treasure. It was in the creek bed that ran along the western edge of the property, a place the family called Black Creek. I had been chipping away at a large flat piece of shale when it split perfectly in two, revealing the delicate, feathery impression of an ancient fern. Fossil. I remember running all the way back to the manor, my heart a drum against my ribs, my muddy shoes leaving a trail across my mother's polished oak floors. I burst into my father's study, where he was hunched over his large desk, surrounded by stacks of paper that always seemed to carry the scent of worry. "Father, look. Look what I found." I held out the two halves of the rock like a holy relic. He glanced up, his brow furrowed with the same frustration he always wore when dealing with numbers that did not add up. He took the rock, his expression unchanging. "Clara, you are dripping mud all over the Aubusson rug. And your dress is torn at the knee. What have I told you about climbing around in that filthy creek?" He handed the fossil back to me without a second look. "It is just a rock, sweetheart. Go have cook find you a biscuit." I remember the heat that flooded my face, a hot tide of shame and disappointment. I looked from the fossil in my hand to my father's dismissive face, and then to my older brother Julian, who was lounging in a wingback chair, smirking. "Still playing with pebbles, Clara?" he had drawled, his voice already carrying the tone of condescension he would perfect in adulthood. My mother appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the commotion. Her eyes went from my muddy shoes to the rug and then to my face, her lips tightening into a thin line of disapproval. "For heaven's sake, Clara. Look at the state of you. You look like a common urchin. Go upstairs and change this instant. And leave that dirty thing outside." The dirty thing was my treasure, the page from the Earth's ancient book. I took it upstairs, cleaned it carefully in my bathroom sink, and hid it in a shoebox under my bed. It was the first of many secrets, the first of many treasures they would never understand. My grandfather was the only one who did. When I showed him the fossil later that day, his eyes lit up. He helped me identify it, showed me how to preserve it, and told me I had a geologist's eye. He passed away 2 years later, and with him went the only sense of validation I had ever felt within my family's walls. Fast forward 20 years, and not much had changed, except the lines of worry on my father's face were now canyons, and the estate's financial troubles were no longer a private anxiety but a looming public catastrophe. I had gone to university and earned a degree in geology, a decision my family had treated with the same enthusiasm as if I had announced I was joining a traveling circus. My father had tried to reason with me. "Clara, what kind of a living can a person make from rocks? It is not practical. Blackwood needs practical solutions." My mother was more concerned with the social implications. "Darling, it is just not a suitable profession for a young woman. All that dirt and the outdoorsiness of it all. What will I tell people?" Julian, by then a junior associate at a soulless investment firm in the city, had simply laughed. "A rock doctor? Seriously? Well, I suppose every family needs its eccentric." I had found work doing contract surveys for engineering firms, but the jobs were sporadic. When a major project fell through, I found myself back at Blackwood Manor, living in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of their disapproval. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Every dinner was a post-mortem of our failing finances. The farm yields were down for the third year in a row, a tractor needed a new engine we could not afford, and the property taxes were a guillotine hanging over our heads. Richard would sit at the head of the table, silent and grim, pushing food around his plate. Beatrice would try to maintain a facade of normalcy, talking about the church bazaar or a neighbor's new car, her voice brittle with unshed tears. Julian would drive up from the city on weekends, his expensive suit and shiny car a stark contrast to the creeping decay of the manor. He would stride in, full of sharp-edged, useless advice. "You need to leverage your assets, father," he would say, pacing the library. "Sell off the north pasture. It is useless for grazing anyway. Subdivide and sell it for development." My father would just shake his head. "That land has been Thorn land since 1790, Julian. We do not sell our land. Then you will lose all of it. Sentimentality is a luxury we can no longer afford." It was during one of these tense weekend dinners that my hobby was once again dragged out for target practice. My father was lamenting the bank's latest refusal to extend our line of credit. "They say we are over-leveraged, that our assets are non-performing," he sighed, rubbing his temples. Julian, ever the helpful son, chimed in. "Well, he is not wrong." He then turned his gaze on me, a smug little smile playing on his lips. "What about you, Clara? Still digging in the dirt? Perhaps you could sell your famous rock collection. I am sure there is a booming market for interesting-looking pebbles." The barb landed, as intended. My mother gave a weak, fluttering laugh, desperate for any change in the oppressive mood. "Oh, Julian, do not be cruel. Though, Clara dear, he has a point. That study of yours is overflowing. It is a terrible fire hazard." My father just grunted, not even bothering to defend me. To him, my geology was just another expense, another impracticality in a life that was drowning in them. I felt that old, familiar heat in my cheeks. But this time it was not just shame. It was anger. A slow, simmering anger that had been building for 2 decades. I looked at their faces. My father's weary defeat, my mother's anxious denial, my brother's arrogant disdain. And I thought, you have no idea. You see nothing. That night I could not sleep. I went to my study, the one room in the house that was truly mine. It was a chaotic sanctuary, shelves overflowing with rock samples, drawers filled with topographical maps, and my computer screen displaying seismic survey data from a past job. They saw it as clutter. I saw it as a language. I pulled out the old estate maps, some of them dating back to the early 1800s. I had spent hundreds of hours cross-referencing them with my own survey notes, creating a detailed geological overlay of the entire property. It was a long-term project, something I did for myself, a way of understanding the secret story of the land my family only saw as a burden. My fingers traced the contour lines of the rugged hilly area in the far northwestern corner of the estate. The back 40, my father called it. He considered it the most useless part of our property. rocky, inaccessible, and impossible to farm. But to a geologist it was the most interesting. As I stared at the map, a detail I had noted months ago but had never fully investigated snagged my attention. It was a peculiar stratification pattern, an outcrop of Pottsville Formation sandstone overlaying a thick layer of moss and shale. The pattern was familiar. It was almost a textbook diagram. My heart began to beat a little faster. I pulled a dusty geology textbook from a shelf, its spine cracked and pages soft with use. I flipped to the chapter on the Carboniferous period, on the formation of coal beds. And there it was. A diagram showing the exact sequence. A basal layer of shale, topped by coal, topped by sandstone. This region was not known for major coal deposits. The significant veins were 100 miles to the east. But geology is full of surprises, of isolated pockets and forgotten seams. It was a wild, audacious, almost ludicrous idea. Long shot. But what did we have to lose? We were already losing everything. In that moment, a decision formed, solid and clear as quartz. I would conduct a systematic geological survey of the back 40. And I would do it in secret. Because the only thing worse than failing would be having to endure their pity and scorn while I tried. The next day, I called my old university professor, Alistair Finch. He was a wonderful man with a shock of white hair and a genuine, unquenchable passion for his subject. He had been my staunchest advocate at university, encouraging my final thesis when my family had urged me to switch to a more sensible business degree. I framed my request carefully, telling him I was working on a personal research project to map the more unusual geological features of my family's land. I did not dare voice my suspicion about coal. It felt too fragile, too easily shattered by a dose of academic skepticism. But Alistair was nothing but encouraging. "Excellent, Clara. That is the spirit. Too many geologists these days are content to just look at computer models. There is no substitute for fieldwork. Boots on the ground, hammer in hand." He sent me links to historical survey data and articles on the region's geological history. His validation was a balm on the raw wound of my family's dismissal. As I was ending the call, my mother walked past the open study door. She paused, looking in at my maps and books with a weary sigh. "Clara, honestly, I just saw Mrs. Pembroke's daughter, Charlotte. She has taken up watercolor painting. She is doing lovely landscapes. It is such a refined, ladylike hobby. You should think about something like that." I just smiled faintly and said, "I prefer my landscapes a bit more three-dimensional, Mother." She shook her head and walked away, completely oblivious to the earthquake that was about to begin right under her feet. The survey was the hardest work I had ever done. It became my secret life. I would wake before dawn while the house was still dark and silent, and slip out with my gear. My grandfather's rock hammer, a backpack filled with sample bags, my Brunton compass, a handheld GPS, and a soil auger. The back 40 was a wild, unforgiving piece of land. The hills were steep, covered in dense thickets of thorn bushes that tore at my clothes and skin. The ground was either slick mud or treacherous, broken rock. Every day, I would return long after dusk, covered in a thick layer of grime, my muscles aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in my bones. I would sneak in through a side door, smuggling my muddy boots and dirty equipment into the small outbuilding I had claimed as my lab, showering quickly before appearing for dinner, feigning a headache or tiredness to explain my disheveled state. My family barely noticed. They were so consumed by their own anxieties that my comings and goings were just background noise. They saw my exhaustion and the scratches on my arms and assumed I had just been aimlessly wandering the woods, indulging in my pointless hobby. There were days, weeks even, when I was certain I was on a fool's errand. I would drill sample after sample with the auger, my hands blistering from the effort, only to pull up core after core of nothing but gray, uninteresting shale. The doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious fog. I would sit on a windswept ridge, looking down at the distant, majestic shape of Blackwood Manor, and a wave of despair would wash over me. What was I doing? I was chasing a fantasy, a geological ghost story, while my family's legacy crumbled into dust. I was just like they thought I was. A dreamer, impractical, wasting my time on dirt and rocks while the real world burned. Julian's mocking voice would echo in my head. Asterisk, still playing with pebbles, Clara? Asterisk on one particularly bad afternoon, after breaking the handle of my auger on a stubborn rock ledge, I sank to the ground, my face in my hands, and just cried. The tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on my cheeks. I was so tired. Tired of the physical work. Tired of the secrecy. Tired of the endless, crushing weight of my family's low expectations. That night I almost gave up. I sat in my study, staring blankly at the maps that now seemed to mock me with their false promise. I picked up my grandfather's rock hammer from my desk. The wood of the handle was smooth, worn into a perfect grip by his hand and then by mine. I remembered what he had told me once, holding that fern fossil. The world is full of secrets, Clara. Most people walk right over them and never even look down. But if you know how to look, how to read the language of the stone, the world will tell you its stories. His memory was a steadying hand on my shoulder. Could not give up. Not for my family, not anymore. But for him. And for myself. The next day I bought a new, stronger auger and went back out. I decided to change my approach. Instead of focusing on drilling, I would focus on the water. Water is a great geological storyteller. It cuts through layers of rock, carrying pieces of the story downstream. I started methodically walking every inch of Black Creek and its smaller tributaries, my eyes scanning the stream bed for anything out of place. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and overcast, when I found it. It was nestled among a collection of ordinary rounded river stones. At first, it looked like a piece of dark, waterlogged wood. But when I picked it up, it was too heavy, too dense. It had a strange, almost greasy luster, even when wet. It was conchoidal, breaking with a curved fracture, unlike the flat, layered shale all around it. My breath caught in my throat. I took a small porcelain plate from my pack, a streak plate, and scraped the stone against it. It left a black, sooty line. I pulled a small knife from my pocket. The blade scratched the stone's surface. It was relatively soft. I knew, with a certainty that made my hands tremble, what I was holding. It was coal. Not the dull, crumbly lignite, but a hard, shiny piece of anthracite. High-quality, high-energy coal. I sank to my knees in the cold creek water, clutching the black stone in my hand as if it were the most precious diamond. I had proof. It was real. The story the rocks were telling was not a fantasy. The coal was here. Now the real hunt began. Finding a single piece of float, a rock carried downstream from its source, was one thing. Finding the parent seam was another entirely. But now I had a starting point. I knew the coal had to be coming from somewhere upstream. For the next 2 weeks, I worked with a renewed, almost manic energy. I became a detective, tracing the source of that single black stone. I worked my way up the creek, taking samples from the banks every 20 feet. I mapped every outcrop, every change in the rock type. The trail led me away from the main creek, up a tiny seasonal stream that trickled down the side of a steep, scrub-covered hill known locally as Miller's Ridge. It was the most unremarkable place on the entire estate. And it was there, halfway up the slope, hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown roots, that I found the outcrop. It was a narrow, exposed band of the same dark, lustrous rock, sandwiched between layers of shale and sandstone. The seam itself. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I had found the source. But the crucial questions remained. How thick was the seam? How deep did it go? How extensive was it? An exposed outcrop did not guarantee a commercially viable deposit. I needed to know what lay beneath the surface. This was the moment of truth. I took a significant portion of my meager personal savings and, telling my family I was renting equipment to help Professor Finch with a university research project, I hired a small, portable core drill for a week. The lie felt like a stone in my gut, but it was a necessary shield against their inevitable questions and skepticism. Getting the drill up the side of Miller's Ridge was a nightmare. Took me 2 full days of sweat and struggle. The drilling itself was even harder. The machine was loud, and I was terrified someone from the house would hear it and come to investigate. I worked relentlessly, drilling core after core, moving across the hill in a systematic grid pattern. The first few cores were disappointing, showing only a thin, fractured vein of coal, less than a foot thick. The familiar tendrils of doubt began to curl in my stomach. Was this it? A tiny, worthless sliver. Had I come all this way for nothing? I decided to try one last spot, further up the ridge, where the ground was flatter. I was exhausted, covered in mud and grease, my optimism worn down to a nub. I set up the drill, the engine sputtering to life, and began to bore into the earth one last time. For the first 10 feet it was just soil and clay. Then the drill hit sandstone, grinding slowly. Then shale. I held my breath. The drill's engine changed pitch as it hit a softer layer. I let it run for what felt like an eternity, feeding the hollow steel tube deeper and deeper into the hill. Finally, I switched off the deafening motor and began the laborious process of extracting the core sample. I pulled the long tube from the earth and laid it carefully on a tarp. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely uncap it. I slid the core out. The top section was shale as expected. But then there was the coal. It was not a foot-thick sliver. It was a solid, unbroken band of pure black anthracite. I measured it with my tape. 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet. My eyes widened. Kept measuring. The solid seam of coal in that single core sample was over 20 feet thick. It was a moment of absolute, triumphant, solitary vindication. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I had done it. Had been right. All the years of being the weird girl who liked rocks, all the condescending remarks from Julian, the disappointed sighs from my parents, the lonely hours of thankless, back-breaking work, it all culminated in this single beautiful cylinder of rock. This was not just a coal seam. It was salvation. It was the answer to every problem my family faced, the solution they had been searching for in all the wrong places, while dismissing the one person who could actually find it. I spent the next 2 days working in a feverish haze, drilling more cores, mapping the seam's boundaries, taking meticulous notes. The results were consistent. I had discovered a massive, high-quality deposit of anthracite coal, a geological anomaly, a forgotten treasure buried right under our failing land. I carefully packed the best core samples into a custom-made wooden box. I compiled all my maps, my survey data, and my calculations into a professional, detailed report. I even had Professor Finch review it via email. His excited one-sentence reply was all the confirmation I needed. "Clara, you have hit the geological lottery." With the locked box in my hand and a strange, calm resolve in my heart, I knew it was time to face my family. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. I overheard a phone call my father was having with the bank. His voice, usually so commanding, was reduced to a desperate, broken plea. When he hung up, he came into the library where my mother and Julian, who had driven up for the emergency, were waiting. The silence in the room was heavy, funereal. "It is over," my father said, his voice hollow. He sank into his leather armchair, looking 100 years old. "They are foreclosing. The auction is in 30 days. Beatrice finally broke, her carefully constructed composure shattering into ragged sobs. Julian, for once, was speechless. He just stood by the fireplace, his face pale, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked not like a high-powered financier, but like a lost little boy. This was the moment. I had been waiting for them to hit rock bottom, because it was the only way they would be desperate enough to listen to me. I walked into the library. My footsteps on the old floorboards were the only sound. I was clean, my hair was brushed, and I was wearing a simple, neat dress. I carried the heavy wooden box I had prepared. They all looked up as I entered, their expressions a mixture of irritation and exhaustion. They were grieving, and my presence felt like an intrusion. "What is it, Clara?" my father asked, his voice weary. "Can't you see we are in the middle of something?" Julian chimed in, his usual arrogance returning. Clara, this is hardly the time for your... whatever it is you do. We are losing our home. I looked at him, my gaze steady. Perhaps not, I said, my voice quiet but clear. The calmness in my tone seemed to surprise them into silence. I walked to the great mahogany desk that had been the seat of Thorne family power for generations, and placed the wooden box on its polished surface with a solid, definitive thud. I turned the small key in the lock and opened the lid. For a moment they just stared. Richard peered at the box's contents with confusion. Beatrice looked on with detached disinterest. Julian scoffed. Rocks. You brought us a box of rocks. Are you insane? Is this some kind of joke? I ignored him. This is not just a box of rocks, I said, my voice gaining strength. This is our future. I reached into the box and carefully lifted out one of the core samples, the one showing the 20-foot seam. I laid it on the desk. Then I took out my geological maps, spreading them across the surface, covering the piles of unpaid bills and threatening bank letters. Finally, I placed my neatly bound report on top. For the past 3 months, I began, my voice ringing with an authority none of them had ever heard from me before. I have been conducting a comprehensive geological survey of the back 40. Julian started to interrupt, but my father held up a hand. His eyes fixed on the core sample. There was a flicker of something in his expression, not understanding but a dawning curiosity. I explained everything. I started from the beginning with the sandstone and shale formations, the theory, the search, the discovery of the float, the outcrop on Miller's Ridge. I used the technical terms: anticline, syncline, strata, overburden. Words they had always considered part of my strange and useless vocabulary. But now they listened. I could see them struggling to keep up, but they were listening. I unrolled the maps and showed them the grid I had drilled, the data points, the calculated boundaries of the deposit. The seam is primarily anthracite, I said, pointing to the dark, glossy band in the core sample. It varies in thickness from 12 to over 25 feet, and my most conservative estimate, based on the survey area, is that the deposit contains a minimum of 4 million tons of recoverable coal. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. 4 million tons. The number hung in the air, an impossible, incredible weight. Julian was the first to break the silence. He snatched the report from the desk and began flipping through it. His eyes scanning the columns of figures, the calculations, the market value analysis I had included. His face went from disbelief to shock, and then to a raw, naked avarice. He looked up from the pages, his mouth slightly agape. 4 million tons, he whispered. At current market rates for anthracite, my God. My father slowly reached out and picked up the core sample. He ran his thumb over the smooth, black surface. He was a man who understood land, who understood the tangible assets of the earth. He might not have understood the geology, but he understood the solid, heavy reality of what he was holding. He looked at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw him truly see me. Not as his strange, disappointing daughter, but as someone else. Someone powerful. Beatrice, who had been watching this all unfold as if it were a play in a foreign language, finally spoke. "Coal," she said, her voice trembling. "You mean, like for fires? Is that valuable?" Julian let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "Valuable, mother. It is a king's ransom. It is more than valuable. Saves us. It saves everything." My father finally raised his head, his eyes meeting mine across the vast expanse of the mahogany desk. The look on his face was not one of gratitude, not yet. It was one of pure, unadulterated shock. The power in the room had shifted. It no longer sat with him in his leather armchair, or with Julian and his city money. It sat with me, the girl with the box of dirty rocks. The days that followed were a blur of surreal activity. The library, once a chamber of despair, became a war room. The despair was replaced by a frantic, gold rush energy. Lawyers were called. Mining consultants were summoned. And at the center of it all, inexplicably, was me. My family, who had never asked for my opinion on anything more important than the choice of a dinner vegetable, now orbited me, their conversations peppered with questions directed my way. Clara, this consultant wants to know the average overburden depth on the western slope. Clara, the lawyer is asking about the exact mineral rights outlined in the original deed from 1820. It was a dizzying reversal of roles. Julian naturally tried to take command. He would stride into meetings, his suit immaculate, and attempt to dominate the conversation with business jargon. We need to focus on maximizing the NPV of this extraction project, focusing on a Q4 start to capitalize on winter fuel prices, he announced at one meeting with a mining executive named Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison, a grizzled man with hands like shovels and eyes that had seen 1,000 rock faces, listened patiently and then turned to me. "That is all well and good, son. But Miss Thorne, you tell me, what is the water table like up on that ridge? And what is the pitch of the main seam? Because that is what is going to determine my extraction cost, not your quarterly projections." I answered his questions calmly and precisely, citing my core data and hydrological surveys. Julian fell silent, a flush creeping up his neck. He was out of his depth, a swimmer in an ocean he did not understand, while I was the one who had drawn the maps of the seafloor. It was in that moment, seeing the mining executive treat me as the sole expert in the room while my brother looked on, impotent, that I realized the true extent of the power shift. My knowledge was the new currency in our family, and I was the only one who was solvent. The family's attempts to adjust to this new reality were clumsy and transparent. They began a campaign of awkward reconciliation, each in their own way. My mother started bringing me tea in my study, a place she had previously avoided as if it were radioactive. "I was just thinking, darling," she said one afternoon, setting a porcelain cup down next to a chunk of granite. "You have always been so clever. Oh, focused. I always knew you had a special talent. It is just so unique." The words felt hollow, manufactured for the moment. She had not always known. She had always been mortified. I thanked her for the tea, and she hovered for a moment longer before retreating, the conversation dying in the unfamiliar territory of praise. My father's approach was different. He cornered me in the gunroom one evening, a place of worn leather and old wood that smelled of oil and his cologne. He tried to connect my discovery to the Thorne legacy. "You know," he said, polishing a shotgun he had not fired in years, "your grandfather Thomas, he loved this land. He would have been so proud of you. You have his eyes, you know, that same way of seeing things. It is in the Thorne blood, this connection to the land." He was trying to absorb my individual achievement into the collective family narrative, to claim it as a part of his lineage rather than something I had accomplished not just without his help, but in spite of his disapproval. I simply nodded and said, "Grandfather would have been interested in the geology, yes." I did not give him the absolution he was looking for. And then there was Julian. He found me poring over survey maps one night and offered me a glass of whiskey, a peace offering from his own expensive collection. "Clara," he started, leaning against the doorframe, trying to look casual. "I have to admit, I am impressed. Seriously. I never would have thought. Well, I guess I owe you an apology. I suppose I have been a bit of a jerk about your work." The apology was wrapped in layers of self-congratulation for being big enough to admit it. "It is just business, you know," he continued, as if that excused 2 decades of mockery. "And from a business perspective, what you have done is brilliant." He had reframed my passion and my scientific achievement into a language he could understand, a brilliant business deal. It was the only way he could process it. I accepted his apology with a cool politeness that offered no warmth, no all-is-forgiven camaraderie. The chasm between us was too wide and too deep to be bridged by a single glass of whiskey. They had not changed. Their circumstances had. Their newfound respect was not for me, but for my utility. And while that was a bitter pill to swallow, I also realized, with a clarity that was as sharp and clean as a freshly split crystal, that I no longer needed their approval. My validation came from the earth itself. A year later, the world was a different place. Or rather, Blackwood Manor was. The sounds of my core drill had been replaced by the distant rhythmic rumble of a modern mining operation on Miller's Ridge. The Thorn Coal Company, a venture my father never could have imagined, was not just solvent, it was wildly profitable. The manor's leaking roofs had been repaired, the faded carpets replaced, the unpaid bills transformed into a robust investment portfolio managed, under my careful supervision by Julian. He was much more deferential now. The estate, and the family's future, was secure for generations. I did not live in my childhood bedroom anymore. Using some of the initial profits, I had commissioned a small, modern house to be built on a secluded part of the estate overlooking the creek where I had found my first fossil. It was a house of glass and local stone, filled with light, books, and maps. My rock collection was not hidden away in a cluttered study. It was displayed like art on custom-built shelves. It was my space, built by my success on my terms. My role had formalized. I was the head of geological operations for the company, a title that still made my mother blink with a sort of baffled pride. I spent my days not in muddy ditches, but liaising with engineers, planning sustainable extraction methods, and scouting new potential sites. I had found a way to turn my passion into a profession that was both intellectually stimulating and incredibly rewarding. I even gave a guest lecture at my old university, in the same hall where I had once been a nervous student. Professor Finch introduced me, his voice thick with pride, calling my discovery a testament to the enduring power of rigorous fieldwork and unwavering curiosity. My family was in the front row. My father in a new suit, looking every inch the proud patriarch. My mother beaming and waving at people she knew. And Julian, listening with an intense, focused expression, finally understanding the value of the subject he had once dismissed as a joke. We still had family dinners at the manor, but the dynamic was irrevocably altered. The conversation no longer revolved around Julian's city triumphs or my father's financial woes. It revolved around me. Clara, the reclamation plan for Phase 1 is up for review. I would like your input. Clara, what do you think about the preliminary survey reports from the eastern property? They looked to me for answers. They deferred to my judgment. They treated me not as a strange daughter, but as the formidable center of their new prosperity. I was gracious. I was professional. I was family. But there was a boundary now, a polite but unbreakable wall of self-possession that had not existed before. I had saved them and they were grateful, but I had done it for myself. My success was not their victory. It was mine. They were simply the beneficiaries of a passion they had never bothered to understand. And in their newfound respect, I saw the reflection of their past ignorance. Looking back on it all now, it is funny how things work out. For so long, I felt like my family's dismissal of my passion was a weight holding me down. But in the end, their underestimation was my greatest advantage. It gave me the freedom to work in secret, without the pressure of their expectations. It forced me to rely on my own judgment, to trust my own knowledge, to find a source of validation within myself because there was none to be found elsewhere. What they saw as worthless dirt and stone was actually the bedrock of our future, the foundation of our salvation. They were so busy looking at the crumbling facade of our legacy that they never thought to look at the ground it was built on. The greatest lesson I learned was not about geology, but about value. My value was never determined by their opinion of me. It was there all along, inherent in my curiosity, my persistence, and my love for the secret stories the earth had to tell. The coal was not the treasure. The treasure was the knowledge that allowed me to find it. And that is something no one can ever take away. So if you have a passion, something that sets your soul on fire, do not ever let anyone make you feel small for it. Do not ever let them call it a strange or dirty hobby. Your passion is your power. Its value is not determined by the approval of others, but by the joy and purpose it brings to you. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever been underestimated, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments below. Let's build a community of people who know their own worth. And please do not forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories. Remember, sometimes the people who believe in you the least end up giving you the most compelling reason to believe in yourself.